Chapter 4, Part 2 of Christian Non-Resistance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 4, Part 2 of Christian Non-Resistance in all its important bearings, illustrated and defended, by Aidan Ballou. Special Illustrations. Facts from Real Life. I now propose to offer a series of facts from real life, illustrative of the truths for which I am contending, and in confirmation of my arguments. Subdued pride and scorn. A lady, in one of the neighbouring towns to that in which the writer resides, had repeatedly treated a well-disposed young man with marked contempt and unkindness. Neither of them moved in the upper circles of society, but the lady, without cause, took numerous occasions to cast reproachful reflections on the young man as beneath her notice, and unfit to be treated with common respect. This lady had the misfortune to meet with a considerable loss in the destruction of a valuable chase, occasioned by the running away of an untied horse. She had borrowed the horse and vehicle, and was required to make good the damage. This was a serious draught on her pecuniary resources, and she felt much distressed by her ill fortune. The young man, being of a kind and generous disposition, and determined to return good for evil, instantly set himself about collecting money on her relief. Subscribing liberally himself, and actively soliciting others, he soon made up a generous sum, and before she became aware of his movement, appeared before her and placed his collection modestly at her disposal. She was thunderstruck. He left her without waiting for thanks or commendation. She was entirely overcome, wept like a child, and declared she would never be guilty again of showing contempt, speaking reproachfully of, or treating with unkindness, him or any other fellow creature. Was there anything in all this contrary to nature? The man whose temper was broken. A man of my acquaintance, on hearing some remarks I had made on this subject, observed that he knew, by experience, the doctrine was correct. And though he himself had never practiced non-resistance from principle in his general life, he practiced it from impulse on one occasion with astonishing success. He was brought up with a childless uncle of his, who was remarkable for his violent anger when excited, and for the cruelty with which he beat his cattle, and such boys as he had taken to bring up, whenever they provoked his vengeance. He could bear but a little from boy or brute, and therefore was a frequent and furious whipper till considerably past the middle age of life. The narrator stated that he was well nigh a man grown, when on a certain occasion he went into the woods with the team, in winter, to sled home fuel. At length, when on their way out of the woods through an unbeaten path, the sled struck some obstacle concealed under the snow, and the team was completely set. The uncle, provoked at this interruption, cried out to his nephew, who held the whip, to drive on and put the cattle through. He shouted and used the lash to order, but in vain. The sled was fast. My uncle flew into a most violent rage, said he, and seizing a club from the load, came furiously at me with terrible threats, as the author of the whole mischief. I felt entirely innocent, and for the moment determined I would not further resist my uncle's wrath than to exchange my whip for his club, which was nearly of the size of a common sled stake. As he rushed upon me, with uplifted weapon, I firmly grasped it in one hand, reached out my cart whip with the other, and said, "Here, uncle, you shall not beat me with such a thing. Take the whip." He instantly relinquished the stick of wood, and seizing the cart whip, beat me outrageously over the head, shoulders, and back. He then offered me the whip, exclaiming with stern vehemence, "Now drive that team home." I calmly but firmly replied, "No. I have done my best, and shall not try again. Drive it yourself, uncle." Upon this, he violently assailed the poor oxen, shouting, screaming, and beating them quite as mercilessly as he had me, till he fairly gave out from exhaustion. Pausing for a moment's rest, and coming a little to his reason, he commenced searching for the obstacle, and soon found that a large-sized sapling had fallen across the path and become firmly bedded in the subsequent snows. Having ascertained this, he directed me to cut off the trunk in order to its removal. I commenced, my back and shoulders smarting grievously from their undeserved stripes. When partly through, I looked up at my uncle and said, "Uncle, do you feel any better for the cruel beating you have given me?" He looked pale and conscience-stricken, and without a word of reply started for home. I extricated the load, and without further difficulty drove the team to its destination. From that time, sir, my uncle never broke out of his old gusts of passion, never struck, scolded, or abused me, never mistreated his cattle, and, going quite to the opposite extreme, suffered himself to be several times almost imposed on by a mischievous lad he had taken to bring up, without inflicting a blow, or even expressing anger. I continued with him several years, and seeing him, as I thought, grown too lax in correcting the lad just named, I one day asked him what had so entirely changed his conduct. He looked me in the face with a melancholy expression. Said he, "Do you remember the cruel flogging I gave you when that load of wood got set in the snow?" "Too well," answered I. "That broke my temper," said he. "I never had such feelings before. I have never been the same man since. I then solemnly vowed never to strike another cruel blow on man or beast while I lived. And I have scarcely felt a disposition to do so since." Large tears rolled down his cheeks, and he turned away in silence. "Many a time have I thought of that matter," said the nephew, "since my uncle has gone to the grave. It convinces me your doctrine is the truth. How does it impress my reader? Does it indicate that non-resistance is contrary to or consonant with the laws of nature?" The Colored Woman and the Sailor. A worthy old colored woman in the city of New York was one day walking along the street, on some errand to a neighbouring store, with her tobacco pipe in her mouth, quietly smoking. A jovial sailor, rendered a little mischievous by liquor, came sawing down the street, and, when opposite our good Phyllis, saucily crowded her aside, and with a pass of his hand knocked her pipe out of her mouth. He then halted to hear her fret at his trick, and enjoy a laugh at her expense. But what was his astonishment, when she meekly picked up the pieces of her broken pipe, without the least resentment in the manner, and giving him a dignified look of mingled sorrow, kindness, and pity, said, "God forgive you, my son, as I do." It touched a tender chord in the heart of the rude tar. He felt ashamed, condemned, and repentant. The tear started in his eye. He must make reparation. He heartily confessed his error, and thrusting both hands into 2 full pockets of change, forced the contents upon her, exclaiming, "God bless you, kind mother, I'll never do so again." The Haymakers. 2 neighbours were getting hay from adjoining lots of marshland. One had the misfortune to mire his team and load so as to require aid from the other. He called to him for assistance with his oxen and men. But his neighbour felt churlish, and loading him with reproaches at his imprudent management, told him to help himself at his leisure. With considerable difficulty he extricated his load from the mire and pursued his business. A day or 2 after, his churlish neighbour met with a similar mishap, whereupon the other, without waiting for a request, volunteered with his oxen and rendered the necessary assistance. The churl felt ashamed of himself. His evil was overcome by his neighbour's good, and he never afterwards refused him a favour. The 2 students. 2 students of one of our universities had a slight misunderstanding. One of them was a warm-blooded Southron. He conceived himself insulted, and began to demand satisfaction, according to Southern notions of honour. He was met with a Christian firmness and gentleness. The other calmly told his excited fellow-student he could give only Christian satisfaction in any case, that he was not conscious of having intended him either injury or insult, and that if he could be convinced he had wronged him at all, he was willing to make ample reparation. The Southron boiled over with chivalrous indignation for a few moments, discharged a volley of reproachful epithets, and threatened to chastise his cowardly insolence. But nothing could move the other's equanimity. Without the slightest indication of fear or servility, he met his opponent's violence with true heroism, declared that they had hitherto been friends, and he meant to maintain his friendly attitude, however he might be treated, and conjured the threatener to consider how unworthy of himself his present temper, language, and conduct were. His manner, look, words, tone had their effect. The flush of anger turned to a blush of shame and compunction. The subdued Southron stepped frankly forward, reached forth his trembling hand, and exclaimed, "I have spoken and acted like a fool. Can you forgive me?" "With all my heart," was the cordial response. Instantly they were locked in each other's embrace, reconciliation was complete, and they were evermore fast friends. The substance of this anecdote was given by a worthy minister of the Baptist persuasion, after one of my lectures on non-resistance, and I think he represented himself as a witness to the scene. 2 neighbours and the manure. 2 of my former neighbours had a slight controversy about a few loads of manure. One of them was the other's tenant. The lesser had distinctly stipulated to reserve all the manure of the stable, and had offset it with certain privileges and favours to the lessee. But as the lessee had purchased and consumed from abroad a considerable amount of hay, he claimed a portion of the manure. He proposed leaving the case to the arbitration of certain worthy neighbours. The other declined all reference to a third party, alleging that they both knew what was right, and ought to settle their difficulties between themselves. But the lessee contrived to have a couple of peaceable neighbours at hand one day, and in their presence renewed with earnestness his proposal to leave out the case to their decision. The other, grieved at his pertinacity, promptly replied, I have nothing to leave out. I have endeavoured to do as I agreed, and to treat you as I would be treated. God Almighty has planted something in our breasts, which tells us what is right and wrong. If you think it right to carry off that manure, do so just when you please, and I pledge myself never to trouble you with even a question about the matter again. This was effectual. The tenant felt his error, all was quiet, the claim expired at the bar of conscience, and non-resistant kindness and decision healed all contention. This was related to me by one of the friends selected as a judge and decider in the case. His peculiar comment was, that was one of the greatest sermons I ever heard. Impounding the horse. A man approached his neighbour in great anger one afternoon, saying, Sirrah, I found your horse loose in the road this morning, and put him in the pound, where he now is. If you want him, go and pay the fees and take him out. And I give you notice now, that just as often as I find him loose in the highway, I will impound him at your cost. And I, said the neighbour, looking out of my window this morning, saw your cows in my cornfield. I drove them all out, and turned them into your pasture. I now give you notice, that as often as I find them in my cornfield, I will do so just again. The first was humbled, reconciled, sent to the pound, paid the fees, and restored his neighbour's horse to him with an honourable apology for his ill temper. Anonymous. Two Neighbours and the Hens. A man in New Jersey told Henry C. Wright the following story respecting himself and one of his neighbours. I once owned a large flock of hens. I generally kept them shut up. But, one spring, I concluded to let them run in my yard, after I had clipped their wings, so that they could not fly. One day, when I came home to dinner, I learned that one of my neighbours had been there, full of wrath, to let me know my hens had been in his garden, and that he had killed several of them, and thrown them over into my yard. I was greatly enraged because he had killed my beautiful hens that I valued so much. I determined at once to be revenged, to sue him, or in some way get redress. I sat down and ate my dinner as calmly as I could. By the time I had finished my meal, I became more cool, and thought that perhaps it was not best to fight with my neighbour about hens, and thereby make him my bitter lasting enemy. I concluded to try another way, being sure that it would be better. After dinner I went to my neighbour's. He was in his garden. I went out and found him in pursuit of one of my hens with a club, trying to kill it. I accosted him. He turned upon me, his face inflamed with wrath, and broke out in a great fury. You have abused me. I will kill all your hens, if I can get at them. I never was so abused. My garden is ruined. I am very sorry for it, said I. I did not wish to injure you, and now see that I have made a great mistake in letting out my hens. I ask your forgiveness, and am willing to pay you 6 times the damage. The man seemed confounded. He did not know what to make of it. He looked up at the sky, then down at the earth, and then at the poor hen he had been pursuing, and said nothing. Tell me now, said I, what is the damage, and I will pay you 6-fold, and my hens shall trouble you no more. I will leave it entirely to you to say what I shall do. I cannot afford to lose the love and goodwill of my neighbours, and quarrel with them, for hens or anything else. I am a great fool, said the neighbour. The damage is not worth talking about, and I have more need to compensate you than you me, and to ask your forgiveness than you mine. Wright's Kiss for a Blow. Henry and Albert. I write chiefly to give you an account of the power of love that took place in the family of an old friend of mine, who is now no more. Besides other children, he left 2 sons, Henry, aged about 20, and Albert, about 16. The latter possessed what is called a bad, ungovernable temper, that gave his mother much trouble, and she, probably in a pet, told Henry he must whip him. He did, but Albert resisted, and he received a severe thrashing. But it did not tame him at all, and he vowed that he never would speak to Henry again, until he was old enough to have his revenge. While he stayed at home, some months I believe, he never spoke to Henry. After this he went to sea, and was absent 4 or 5 years. But Albert was a boy of many good qualities. He laid up money, and while the vessel was loading and unloading at the ports of the distant countries he visited, he made short excursions into the interior, and made use of his eyes and ears to improve his mind and gain what information he could, and came back an amazingly stout, athletic young man, and apparently greatly improved. He was frank and social with the rest of the family, but not a word did he say to Henry. The latter by this time had become a Methodist preacher, and Albert's conduct toward him grieved him to the heart. After a time, Henry went to Albert, and with tears in his eyes, said to him, Albert, I cannot possibly live in this way any longer. Your silence I cannot bear another hour. You remember you said, when you had whipped me you would speak to me again. I am now ready to receive my punishment. Let us go to the barn. I will pull off my coat. I promise you that I will make no resistance, and you may whip me as long as you please. And we will then be friends. I never should have struck you, if mother had not requested it. I am sorry that I did. Albert's stout heart could bear blows in almost any quantity without shrinking, but Henry's love he could not withstand. It melted his proud spirit instantly, and in a moment he was bathed in tears. They embraced each other directly. For a time their love was too great for utterance, but soon Albert expressed his regret for what he had said, and they are now, for aught that I know, two as loving brothers as any in the country. And to God, the God of peace, be all the glory. Letter from Alfred Wells in the Practical Christian. The Subdued Hatter. Some 19 or 20 years ago, when I was in the hatting business, I employed a man by the name of Jonas Pike, from Massachusetts, who was a most excellent workman in the manufacture of hats. But he was one of that kind of journeymen who would have their trains, as they were familiarly called amongst us in that day. Therefore, as a natural consequence, he was without comfortable clothing the most of the time. After he got a shop, he would work very industriously until he had earned from $20 to $30, and sometimes $40 worth of clothing, for he was always in want of clothing when he commenced work. And then he would get on one of his trains, and dispose of every article of his clothing that would fetch 6 cents, expending all for whiskey. When all was gone, and he began to cool off a little, he would be very ugly. Sometimes he would fret and scold, and then he would coax and plead, to have me trust him a hat or something else, that he might sell, and thereby get more whiskey. When I refused him, he would become very angry and threaten to whip me, which I told him he might do as soon as he pleased. But, said he, I will not do it in your own shop. If I had you out of doors I would thrash you like a sack. After hearing him repeat these sayings several times, I walked out at the door. I then spoke to him, saying, I am now out of the shop. Thou canst whip me if thou wishest to so very much. At which he stepped out of the shop, came furiously toward me, squaring himself for a box, and struck me a blow on the breast, at which I put my hand upon my cheek, and held it down to him, saying, Now strike here, Jonas. He now looked at me with surprise and astonishment, then turning round, saying at the same time, Damn you, if you will not fight, I will let you alone. He went into the shop, sat down, and was quiet. He got sober and went to work, and ever after was affectionate and kind, and very peaceable with me. I employed him several times afterwards to work for me, and he was always very peaceable and obliging. Letter from Erastus Hanchett in the Practical Christian. The Revolutionary Soldier. A beloved brother, now dead, related to me a circumstance of his life, which I think is worth preserving. He was a soldier in the Revolutionary War. After he came here, he became religious, and was convinced that all wars and fightings are contrary to the gospel of Christ. His zeal in advocating his principles stirred up the enmity of a wicked man in the neighborhood, who threatened, when his son came home from the army, he would flog him. Sure enough, when the son came home, the old man told such stories to him about this brother, that it excited him to that degree that he came to the house where my brother lived in a rage, determined to fight. My brother expostulated with him, and endeavoured, by all means in his power, to allay his anger, and deter him from his purpose, but all would not do. Fight he must, and fight he would. Well, says the brother, if we must fight, don't let us be like cats and dogs, fighting in the house. So go out into the field. To this he assented. When they had got into the field, and the young bully had stripped himself for the fight, my brother looked him in the face, and said, Now you are a great coward. Coward? Don't call me a coward. Well, you are one of the greatest cowards I ever saw. What do you mean? I mean as I say. You must be a very great coward to go fighting a man who will not fight you. What, don't you mean to fight me? Not I. You may fight me as much as you please, I shall not lift a finger against you. Is that your principle? Yes, it is, and I mean to be true to it. The spirit of the young soldier fell, and stretching out his arm, he said, Then I would sooner cut off that arm than I would strike you. They then entered into an explanation, and parted good friends. Non-resistant. Ex-President Jefferson and the Cooper's Shop. The following was related, many years since, by one of the parties, who was a very respectable citizen of Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, since deceased. During the presidential term of Thomas Jefferson, 2 young men from Pennsylvania took a lease from him of his merchant mill at Monticello, one of the stipulations of which was that the landlord should erect for their use, within a given period, a cooper's shop. The time for a meeting of Congress soon arriving, the President had to repair to Washington to attend to his official duties, where he remained a long time absorbed in national concerns, and the building of the cooper's shop was entirely forgotten by him. Not so with his tenants, whose daily wants constantly reminded them of the provisions contained in the lease, and finally they determined to erect it themselves, and charge the cost of it to their landlord. On the return of the President to his mansion, the parties met to settle a long account current, which had been running during his absence. The items were gone over and scrutinized one by one, and all found satisfactory but the charge for building the cooper's shop, to which he objected, alleging that he could have erected it with his own workmen. Several attempts were made to effect a settlement, but they always failed when they came to the cooper's shop. The young men became warm and zealous in the affair, and the parties, instead of getting nearer together, found themselves at every interview wider apart. In this state of affairs, the father of the young men, who was a mild, affable, conciliating gentleman, possessing some knowledge of the world and its ways, arrived on a visit to his sons, who informed him of their difficulty with their landlord. He requested them to leave it to him, observing that he thought he could effect an amicable settlement in the case. This course was accordingly acceded to, and in due time he waited on the President with the account. It was scanned and agreed to, except the charge for building the shop, which, he said, with some firmness, he should not allow for reasons stated. His opponent, observing his apparent decision on the subject, very gravely remarked, Well, friend Jefferson, it has always been my practice through life, to yield rather than to contend. Immediately on this remark being made, the President's chin fell on his breast for an instant, when, raising his head in an erect position, he observed in a very emphatic manner, A very good principle, Mr. Shoemaker, and I can carry it as far as you can. Let the account for the cooper's shop be allowed. Thus ended the difficulty, and the parties continued their friendly regard for each other till death separated them. And the cultivation of a similar disposition, to follow peace with all men, would terminate thousands of difficulties, add much to the happiness of individuals, and tend to promote the general harmony and order of society. Farmer's Cabinet. William Ladd and Neighbor Pulsifer. The late William Ladd, denominated the apostle of the peace cause, used to relate the following anecdote. I had a fine field of grain growing upon an out farm, some distance from the homestead. Whenever I rode by, I saw my neighbor Pulsifer's sheep in the lot, destroying my hopes of a harvest. These sheep were of the gaunt, long-legged kind, active as spaniels. They could spring over the highest fence, and no wall could keep them out. I complained to neighbor Pulsifer, and sent him frequent messages, but all without avail. Perhaps they would be kept out for a day or two, but the legs of his sheep were long, and my grain rather more tempting than the adjoining pasture. I rode by again. The sheep were all there. I became angry, and told my men to set the dogs on them, and if that would not do, I would pay them if they would shoot them. I rode away much agitated, for I was then not so much of a peace man as I am now, and I felt literally full of fight. All at once a light flashed in upon me. I asked myself, would it not be well for you to try in your own conduct the peace principle you are preaching to others? I thought it all over, and settled down my mind as to the best course to be pursued. The next day I rode over to see neighbor Pulsifer. I found him chopping wood at his door. Good morning, neighbor. No answer. Good morning, I repeated. He gave a kind of grunt, like a hog, without looking up. I came, continued I, to see about the sheep. At this he threw down his axe, and exclaimed in a most angry manner, Now aren't you a pretty neighbor to tell your men to kill my sheep? I heard of it, a rich man like you to shoot a poor man's sheep. I was wrong, neighbor, said I, but it won't do to let your sheep eat up all that grain. So I came to say that I would take your sheep to my homestead pasture, and put them with mine, and in the fall you may take them back. And if any one of them is missing, you may take your pick out of my whole flock." Pulsifer looked confounded. He did not know how to take me. At last he stammered out, "Now, squire, are you in earnest?" "Certainly I am," I answered. "It is better for me to feed your sheep in my pasture on grass, than to feed them here on grain. And I see the fence cannot keep them out." After a moment's silence, "The sheep shan't trouble you any more," exclaimed Pulsifer. "I will fetter them all. But I'll let you know, when any man takes off shooting, I can shoot too, and when they are kind and neighbourly, I can be kind too." The sheep never again trespassed on my lot. "And, my friends," continued Father Ladd, addressing his audience, "remember that when you talk of injuring your neighbours, they talk of injuring you. When nations threaten to fight, other nations will be ready too. Love will beget love. A wish to be at peace will keep you at peace. You can overcome evil only with good. There is no other way." Democratic Review. Conclusion. The foregoing illustrations are from the common affairs of life, and though not involving cases of extreme personal danger and escape, are nevertheless pertinent and important. They show the adaptation of Christian non-resistance to human nature in the 10,000 occurrences of personal difficulty. They demonstrate that it is not contrary to nature, but is peculiarly suited to allay and purify the rising passions of men, that the worst of people are favourably affected by its interposition, that the decent sort might be preserved by it from numberless contentions, and that instead of counteracting the law of self-preservation, it is the highest and surest method of securing the great ends of that law. This will be more fully demonstrated by a continuation of illustrations involving cases of great peril and deliverance in the next chapter. In the meantime, I can hardly refrain from pressing upon the reader's understanding and conscience the question, is not the doctrine contended for most Christian, most rational, most excellent, most admirably adapted to promote peace on earth and goodwill among mankind? Is it not just what poor groaning nature needs, to soothe, restore it to health, and carry it forward to its glorious destiny? It will appear more and more sound and lovely, the more it is investigated. O when will man unshackled rise, from dross of earth refined, read mercy in his neighbour's eyes, and be for ever kind. End of chapter 4, part 2.